Usually, when we talk about making a medical diagnosis, there is a certain expectation of precision.
Right.
You think of it almost like engineering.
Right. It's very clinical.
Yeah, exactly. If you fall and break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
It's totally binary. A bone is either broken or it's intact. I mean, the visual evidence is right there in front of you. And it provides this strange sense of comfort, really, because we are wired to like things that can be easily categorized.
We are. But the moment you step out of a sterile clinic and into the messy world of human behavior, into neurodevelopment or childhood trauma or even deep spiritual reform, that clean binary X-ray machine just completely shatters.
It really does. It gets complicated fast.
Suddenly, you are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. And that murky, complicated reality of the human heart is exactly what we're wading into today.
Yeah, it's a deep one today.
We are exploring the life of an ancient king who completely defies simple categorization, a man whose life reads like a modern political thriller. I mean, it has assassination plots, bureaucratic corruption, international sieges, and just a really tragic, violent unraveling.
We are systematically unpacking 2 Kings chapter 12 from the Hebrew Bible, focusing specifically on the King James translation.
Right.
And to really grasp what is happening in this text, we have pulled together a massive stack of theological commentaries, archaeological research, historical analyses, and cross-references. We're tracing the reign of King Jehoash, who is also often referred to as Joash.
And if you're joining us today, you are probably familiar with the broad strokes of biblical history, but we are going way beyond the Sunday school summary here.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a king who began his life with a miraculous survival, who instituted these profound structural reforms, and yet he ended his life in this dark cocktail of compromise and murder.
It's a heavy trajectory.
It is. This isn't just dusty ancient history. It's a deep study on the nature of leadership, the fragility of what we might call borrowed faith, and the unseen spiritual battles that shape human trajectories. So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we even look at the first verse of chapter 12, we have to look at the map.
The map is everything here.
Right, because Joash doesn't inherit a blank slate. He inherits a geopolitical nightmare.
He really does. You absolutely have to understand the fractures of the ancient Near East around the late 9th century BC to understand a single decision Joash makes.
Let's set the stage for us.
Well, if you rewind to the golden era of King David and King Solomon, you have this unified, incredibly wealthy Israelite kingdom. But around 930 BC, under the weight of Solomon's later compromises and his son Rehoboam's disastrously arrogant tax policies, the nation suffered a massive civil and spiritual divorce.
It completely fractured.
Exactly. The kingdom split into two distinct warring entities.
A split that defined the geopolitics of the region for centuries, really. So let's break down that map for the listener.
Sure. So in the north, you have the northern kingdom. This comprised 10 of the 12 tribes. And depending on which prophetic book or historical text you are reading, it's referred to interchangeably as Israel, or sometimes Ephraim.
Ephraim, because it was the dominant tribe. Right?
Yeah, Ephraim was its dominant, most populous tribe. And eventually its capital was established at Samaria. Now, during the specific timeline of Joash's story, the north is ruled by the Jehu dynasty, but the defining characteristic of the northern kingdom is its state-sanctioned spiritual compromise.
Because Jeroboam, the very first king of that northern splinter state, he basically panicked.
He did.
He realized that if his citizens kept traveling south to Jerusalem for the annual religious festivals, their loyalties would eventually shift back to the Davidic dynasty.
Right, so he manufactured a completely new religious system. He set up golden calves at the northern and southern borders of his territory at Dan and Bethel. Yeah, and he told the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods. I mean, it was a cynical, pragmatic political move disguised as religious convenience, political survival through spiritual corruption.
Meanwhile, in the south, you have the southern kingdom. This is known as Judah.
Yeah.
And you'll also hear it referred to as Jerusalem, Zion, or the house of David.
Right.
And this is the theater for our story today. Judah was much smaller territorially, consisting primarily of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but it held two immense theological trump cards.
The covenant and the temple?
Exactly. The Davidic covenant, which was God's promise that David's royal line would endure forever, and the true temple built by Solomon.
Yet, holding the true temple did not make Judah a spiritual utopia.
Bad at all.
They were constantly wrestling with the gravitational pull of the surrounding Canaanite culture. They struggled with lingering pagan practices. I mean, the division of the kingdom served as a protective quarantine for the Messianic line in Judah, keeping it somewhat insulated from the rampant apostasy of the north. But the borders were porous.
Right, the cultural and spiritual rot was always seeping in.
Always. And that tension-filled, compromised atmosphere is the exact environment Joash is thrust into.
Well, I want to pause on the name Joash for a second, because if you're reading through the text yourself, you hit this linguistic curiosity almost immediately. The text toggles back and forth between calling him Jehoash and Joash.
Yeah, it can be really confusing.
To a modern reader, it almost feels like a typo, or like the text is confusing two different people.
That confusion is incredibly common for modern readers, but it's actually a standard linguistic feature in ancient Hebrew texts. Jehoash and Joash are the exact same person.
Right.
Jehoash is the formal, complete theophoric name, and a theophoric name is simply a name that embeds the name of a deity. It incorporates the divine prefix Yeho, which is a shortened form of Yahweh, the covenant name of God.
So it's his formal royal birth certificate name.
Yes, exactly. Joash is just the contracted colloquial form of that exact same name. Think of it like someone being named Jonathan, but going by John in everyday conversation.
That makes perfect sense.
But what really matters here is the etymology. Both variations fundamentally mean Yahweh has given or given by the Lord.
And the theological irony of that name is staggering when you look at his origin story. His very existence is a literal manifestation of Yahweh has given.
Oh, the backstory is wild.
It is. If you look at the chapter just prior, 2 Kings 11, Joash's grandmother is a woman named Athaliah. She's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel from the northern kingdom, and she married into the southern kingdom. When her son, the king of Judah, dies, Athaliah decides she wants the throne for herself.
She just seizes power.
Yeah, but she systematically attempts to exterminate the entire Davidic royal line, her own grandchildren.
It is a terrifying, bloody purge. But Joash, as a tiny infant, is the sole survivor. He is stolen away by his aunt Jehosheba and hidden in the very temple of God for 6 years.
Just incredible.
He is raised in secret by the high priest Jehoiada. So when he is finally brought out at age 7 and crowned king, he is literally given back to the nation from the inner sanctuary of the temple.
Given by the Lord.
Exactly. He was preserved to keep the Messianic lineage alive. His life was not just a political restoration, it was a miraculous gift.
Which brings us directly into the opening verses of chapter 12. Joash ascends to the throne. He's 7 years old. He begins his reign in the 7th year of Jehu, the king of the north, and he rules for 40 years in Jerusalem.
A long reign.
Yeah. And verse 1 also makes a very specific point to mention his mother. It says, his mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. I always wonder why ancient texts pause a fast-moving narrative to drop in a seemingly minor biographical detail like a mother's hometown.
Well, the authors of the historical books of the Hebrew Bible do not waste ink. Mentioning the Queen Mother is standard bureaucratic practice for the kings of Judah, but highlighting that Zibiah was from Beersheba is highly intentional.
Why is that?
Beersheba was a deeply conservative, ancient southern city. It is geographically isolated from the northern borders and is heavily associated with the founding patriarchs of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So it's a political signal. The text is rooting Joash deeply in authentic, conservative Judean heritage.
Precisely.
It's creating a sharp contrast with the northern idolatrous influence of his murderous grandmother, Athaliah.
That is the exact implication. He is biologically of the Davidic line, and his maternal roots are grounded in the deep south. He is presented as a true son of Judah. And verse 2 gives us the summary of his spiritual report card, which states, "And Jehoash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him."
I am going to push back on that verse immediately, because reading that, it sounds like a glowing endorsement.
That does sound like it.
But verse 3 drops a massive, dark caveat right on top of it. It says, "But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places." So, I question how good Joash really was.
That is a very fair question.
His righteousness seems completely tethered to his mentor, Jehoiada. It reminds me of a teenager who keeps their room perfectly clean, gets their homework done early, acts flawlessly, but only because their parent is standing in the doorway watching them.
Right, the external motivation.
The minute that parent leaves town, the house turns into a disaster zone. Is Joash's faith actually internalized, or is he just operating on borrowed faith?
What's fascinating here is, I would argue, the text is actively diagnosing that exact psychological vulnerability. You are looking at the severe danger of secondhand faith.
Yeah.
Joash had a profound, understandable respect for Jehoiada. I mean, Jehoiada wasn't just a priest. He was the man who saved Joash from a massacre, hid him for 6 years, orchestrated a coup to put a crown on his head, and acted as his surrogate father.
He owed him everything.
Joash owed him everything. But because of that intense dependency, Joash's moral compass remained entirely externalized. He relied on Jehoiada to be his conscience.
And we see the proof of that externalized conscience in the high places. Let's define what those are for the listener, because these aren't just scenic overlooks.
No, not at all. The high places, or bamot in Hebrew, were local elevated shrines or altars where people worshipped. Now, the law of Moses was very clear. Once the Israelites were settled in the land, all sacrificial worship was supposed to be centralized at the temple in Jerusalem.
Right, for theological purity.
Exactly, to maintain theological purity and unity. But practically, traveling to Jerusalem was hard. So people set up these local shrines. Sometimes they were actually worshiping Yahweh at these high places, but doing it in an unauthorized, illegal way.
Okay.
Other times, these high places were fully dedicated to Canaanite deities like Baal or Asherah.
So by leaving them standing, Joash is basically enacting a half measure. He is sanitizing the kingdom, bringing the main focus back to the temple, but he isn't curing the cultural rot. He leaves the localized altars of compromise standing.
Yeah.
And that specific compromise is exactly why his later structural reforms ultimately collapse.
It's the anatomy of partial obedience. When a leader tolerates low-level, decentralized corruption because it's culturally popular or, too difficult to eradicate, that corruption eventually centralizes and devours the leadership itself.
Wow. That lack of internal drive really sets the stage for Section 2 of our deep dive. Joash grows up. His early zeal, which is heavily guided by Jehoiada, manifests in this massive desire to repair the physical center of their faith, Solomon's temple.
Right, it needed a lot of work.
During the reign of his wicked grandmother, Athaliah, the temple had been vandalized, broken down, and its sacred items repurposed for the worship of Baal. So in verses 4 through 6, Joash commands the priests to gather all the dedicated money and use it to repair the breaches of the house.
He wants to fix the structural damage.
He lays out 3 specific streams of revenue: the census tax, personal vows, and free will offerings.
The economics here are fascinating. According to Exodus 30, every Israelite male over the age of 20 had to pay a half shekel census tax. It was a ransom for their soul, essentially. It was a flat tax, emphasizing that everyone was equal before God. Then you had the money from personal vows, where someone would dedicate a specific monetary value to the Lord based on a priestly assessment. And finally, the free will offerings, which were just spontaneous gifts.
So Joash sets up a decentralized collection system. He tells the priests to collect the money from their acquaintances. So priests who lived in different regions would gather funds from their personal networks and bring them to Jerusalem to fund the repairs.
Sounds like a great plan.
It sounds like a really solid grassroots fundraising campaign. But then, verse 6 hits us with a jarring reality check. It fast forwards to the 23rd year of King Jehoash's reign. And what have the priests done? Nothing.
Not a single thing.
The text says the priest has not repaired the breaches of the house.
It is a staggering administrative failure. We are talking about 2.5 decades of stagnant bureaucracy.
Look, I've dealt with slow contractors, but 23 years. I mean, are we assuming the priests were just maliciously embezzling the funds? Or was the project just vastly underfunded because the grassroots collection method didn't work?
Some cynical commentators immediately jump to embezzlement, but if you look at the sociology of organizations, you don't need malice to explain this.
Really?
Yeah, you just need what economists call the principal-agent problem.
Okay, break that down for us. How does a modern economic theory apply to ancient temple priests?
So the principal-agent problem occurs when one person or entity, the agent, is able to make decisions or take actions on behalf of another person or entity, the principal. The dilemma exists because sometimes the agent is motivated to act in their own best interests rather than those of the principal.
Okay. I see where this is going.
Right. In this scenario, Joash and the people are the principals. They want the temple fixed. The priests are the agents entrusted with the money and the task, but priests are not project managers.
They aren't builders.
No, they are trained in liturgy, sacrifice, and ritual purity. And their daily survival depends on the offerings brought to the temple. So, as the money comes in, they likely started using it for their own daily sustenance, the upkeep of their priestly garments, and the ongoing costs of the sacrificial system.
They just reallocated the budget.
They probably rationalized it, thinking, taking care of the priesthood is taking care of the temple. We'll get to the structural repairs eventually.
But eventually turns into 23 years of rotting beams and crumbling stones. They lacked the incentive to finish the building project because they controlled the funds regardless.
Exactly.
So Joash finally intervenes. In verses 7 through 16, he holds a massive audit. He summons Jehoiada and the other priests and basically says, "Why aren't you fixing the building? Stop taking money from your acquaintances and hand over what you have." He strips the spiritual leaders of their financial control over the construction.
Which is a bold political move.
Yeah.
He is publicly reprimanding the very class of people who put him in power.
Very risky.
But the solution they devise is an incredible piece of administrative innovation. In verse 9, Jehoiada the priest takes a single chest, bores a hole in the lid, and places it beside the altar right on the right side as you enter the house of the Lord.
This is literally the first recorded offering box in history.
It is, and the mechanism of this box completely shifts the power dynamic. It represents a massive paradigm shift toward financial transparency. Under the old system, you handed your money to a priest you knew, and you just hoped it made its way to the masonry fund.
Correct. There was no paper trail.
Under this new system, the people bypassed the middleman. They dropped their silver directly into the chest themselves.
And the accountability measures they put in place are fascinating. Verse 10 says that when they saw the chest was full, the king's scribe, a secular royal official, and the high priest would come together. They essentially required 2 keys to open the safe.
Exactly. It's a dual control mechanism. You have a representative of the state and a representative of the church. They would open the chest, count the money jointly, bind it up in bags, and weigh it. But the most important part of this reform is what happened next.
What's that?
They bypassed the priestly bureaucracy entirely. They didn't give the money back to the priests to hire workers. They handed the money directly to the project managers, the overseers of the work, who then paid the carpenters, the builders, the masons, and the stone hewers.
There is a detail in verse 15 that I think is one of the most profound statements on human integrity in the entire historical record. The text says, "Moreover, they reckoned not with the men into whose hand they delivered the money to be bestowed on workmen, for they dealt faithfully."
That is such a powerful verse.
Think about the contrast there. Joash had to implement a dual-control lockbox audit system just to keep the religious elite from mismanaging funds. But when it came to the blue-collar workers, the guys covered in stone dust and sawdust, they didn't even require an itemized receipt.
No audit needed for them.
The foreman handled the money with absolute faithful integrity.
It elevates the concept of lay ministry. It demonstrates that doing your daily practical work with honesty is a profound form of worship. The text is making a theological point. The sacredness of the temple was restored through the secular integrity of honest laborers, not just the religious zeal of the priesthood.
And they were ruthless about their priorities. Verse 13 specifically notes what they did not do with the money. They didn't make bowls of silver, snuffers, basins, trumpets, or any vessels of gold or silver. Every single coin went strictly to the structural repair of the walls and the timber.
They understood that you cannot prioritize aesthetics over infrastructure. You have to secure the foundation and fix the breaches before you worry about the shiny liturgical items.
Right.
It's a brilliant lesson in institutional management. When the general public saw this level of transparency, when they knew their hard-earned money was going directly to the guys fixing the walls rather than disappearing into a bureaucratic black hole, they gave generously.
People want to fund a project that actually works.
Yeah, exactly. Joash recognizes that institutional stagnation is fundamentally a spiritual issue, and he implements a practical, transparent system to cure it.
It's an incredible high point in his reign. The external structure of the temple is finally secure, the breaches are repaired, the people are unified, but the resolution of that internal failure creates a false sense of security.
It really does.
Because the moment those external walls are fortified, the internal spiritual fortitude of the king is shattered by a terrifying external threat. Which brings us to section 3, the Syrian threat.
Yes. Verse 17 introduces a name that strikes terror into the heart of the ancient Near East. Hazael, king of Syria, or Aram.
We need to spend some time on Hazael, because this man is not just your run-of-the-mill rival monarch. He is a ruthless, calculated, deeply ambitious usurper.
To understand the sheer panic Hazael inspired in Jerusalem, you have to look back a few chapters to 2 Kings 8. Hazael was originally a high-ranking official in the court of the Syrian king Ben-Hadad II in Damascus. The Israelite prophet Elisha actually traveled to Damascus, and when he saw Hazael, Elisha began to weep uncontrollably.
Wow.
He prophesied the horrific atrocities Hazael would commit against the Israelites, setting their strongholds on fire, slaying their young men with the sword, dashing their children to pieces.
A completely chilling prophecy.
And Hazael's response to realizing his own dark destiny was immediate violence. He returned to his king, took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and smothered Ben-Hadad to death in his bed.
He just murdered him.
He seized the throne through cold-blooded, intimate murder. He is a hardened, battle-tested warlord.
And he immediately begins expanding his territory. Verse 17 tells us that Hazael goes up and fights against Gath and takes it. If you're listening, you might remember Gath as one of the major Philistine Pentapolis cities. It was a massive, incredibly fortified urban center.
A huge stronghold.
But I want to focus on the archaeological reality of what Hazael did to Gath, because it puts the fear of Joash into perspective. Excavations at a site called Tel Esafi, which is ancient Gath, have uncovered the remains of Hazael's siege.
This archaeology is amazing.
Archaeologists found a massive 2-kilometer-long siege trench surrounding the city. It is literally the earliest known archaeological evidence of a siege system in the world. Hazael didn't just attack Gath, he built a suffocating infrastructure around it, starved the population, and then burned the city to the ground. The destruction layer is over a meter thick in some places.
The fall of Gath is a catastrophic strategic shift for Judah. Geographically, Gath is located in the Shephelah,
which is the buffer zone.
Right, the Shephelah is the region of rolling foothills that serves as a vital buffer zone between the coastal plain, where the Philistines lived, and the steep Judean mountains where Jerusalem sits. As long as Gath stood, Jerusalem had a western shield.
But now Gath is gone.
When Hazael obliterates Gath, that buffer is gone. The Syrian army can now pivot east and march straight up the ascent into the mountains. And that is exactly what verse 17 says happens. And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem.
The ultimate threat is now literally at Joash's doorstep. The man who just choked out a massive Philistine fortress is marching his siege engineers toward the newly repaired walls of Jerusalem. So how does Joash respond? Think about his history. This is the boy saved in the temple, the man who just spent immense political capital and years of his life painstakingly repairing that same temple.
The irony is heavy.
In the past, his ancestors, kings like Jehoshaphat or Hezekiah later on, would face these existential threats by going into the temple, laying the enemy's threats before the altar, fasting and crying out to God for deliverance. But Joash completely panics.
He completely folds.
Verse 18 details his capitulation. He takes all the hallowed things, the sacred memorials dedicated by his fathers Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah. He takes his own dedicated things. He empties all the gold found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord, and he packs it all up and sends it to Hazael as a bribe. He buys him off.
And it works, physically at least.
Yeah, Hazael takes the massive payoff and turns his army away from Jerusalem. Here's where it gets really interesting, because I'm going to play devil's advocate here. From a purely secular political standpoint, isn't this brilliant?
How so?
Joash doesn't have the military strength to defeat a warlord who just invented the siege trench. He knows his city will be slaughtered, so he uses the treasury for its exact purpose, state security. He pays the ransom, saves tens of thousands of lives, and lives to rule another day. That is textbook realpolitik. It's practical politics over ideological purity.
Well, I see why you'd argue that, and any secular ancient historian would agree with you. It is the ultimate appeasement strategy. But you are evaluating this through the lens of political survival, while the author of 2 Kings is evaluating it through the lens of covenant theology. The author is a prophetic historian.
Explain the difference. Why is the prophetic historian condemning a move that saved lives?
Because of what the temple represents. The temple was not just a national reserve bank. It was the physical intersection of heaven and earth. It was the symbol of God's covenant presence with his people.
Right.
The gold and the hallowed things were consecrated, meaning they were set apart entirely for God, dedicated after previous military victories as an acknowledgement that Yahweh was the true king of Judah.
Okay, so it belonged to God, not the state.
By taking what belonged to God and handing it over to a pagan tyrant, Joash is making a devastating theological statement. He is declaring that he fears the Syrian sword more than he trusts the God of the temple. He believes Hazael has more power to destroy him than Yahweh has power to save him.
The psychological sunk cost is tragic. He just spent 23 years obsessing over fixing the masonry of the temple, only to personally strip its interior bare the moment he gets scared. He undoes his own life's work.
He fortifies the outside but guts the inside, which perfectly mirrors his own spiritual state.
Exactly. It reveals that underlying vulnerability we discussed in Section 1. His faith was purely external. Without Jehoiada there to hold his hand, direct his focus, and tell him to trust God, Joash defaults to fear, panic, and appeasement.
Right.
And that external threat forcing his hand causes an internal collapse, which transitions us into the dark, unseen turn of his reign in Section 4. Because 2 Kings 12 gives us the political what of Joash's reign. The temple repairs, the bribe, the assassination, but it glosses over the psychological why.
We need more context.
To truly understand why Joash unravels so violently, we have to cross-reference this account with the parallel historical record found in 2 Chronicles chapter 24.
Yes. If 2 Kings is the official state news report, 2 Chronicles is the behind-the-scenes documentary that exposes the motives. And the pivotal event that triggers this catastrophic downward spiral is the death of his mentor. Jehoiada the priest dies. And he dies at the astonishing age of 130 years old.
130 years old. He lived through the reigns of multiple kings, the division of the kingdom, the usurpation of Athaliah, and the restoration of the temple. He is a towering figure.
He is so revered by the nation that Chronicles tells us he is buried in the city of David among the kings.
Which is unheard of for a priest.
Exactly. He wasn't of royal blood, but he had saved the kingdom and restored the covenant. It is a massive, unprecedented honor, reflecting the immense stabilizing force he was for the nation of Judah.
But the tragedy of a stabilizing force is what happens when it is removed. The moment Jehoiada is buried in the royal tombs, the unanchored character of Joash is exposed. According to 2 Chronicles 24, right after Jehoiada dies, the princes of Judah, the secular aristocracy, the political elites of the kingdom come to Joash, and they flatter him. They bow down to him.
They finally get his ear.
Think about the psychology of a king who has lived his entire life under the strict righteous tutelage of a surrogate father figure. He probably felt like he was perpetually in Jehoiada's shadow. Now the old man is gone, and the wealthiest, most powerful peers in his kingdom are bowing before him, validating him, giving him the autonomy he likely spent his whole life craving.
It demonstrates how incredibly susceptible an insecure leader is to flattery. Power isolates a leader, and flattery is the easiest way to manipulate that isolation. The princes offer Joash a more culturally permissive, syncretic way of life.
Let's clarify syncretic for the listener, because that's a crucial concept here.
Syncretism is the blending of different religious beliefs and practices. The princes weren't necessarily asking Joash to formally denounce Yahweh. They were offering a syncretic way of life, meaning he didn't have to stop worshiping Yahweh entirely. He just had to blend it with the local pagan gods so that everyone was happy and culturally integrated with their neighbors.
So it's a compromise.
Right. They wanted to worship the Asher poles and the idols alongside the God of Israel.
It's the ultimate dilution of truth. And because Joash's faith was never truly internalized, he folds almost immediately. He abandons the very temple he spent decades repairing.
It's a sad shift.
But the text shows that God is incredibly merciful, even in the face of this betrayal. God sends prophets to call Joash and the princes back. He gives them chances to repent, but they ignore the prophets. Finally, the Spirit of God comes upon a man named Zechariah. Now, Zechariah is not just an anonymous street preacher. He is the son of Jehoiada.
He is the son of the man who saved Joash's life. He is essentially Joash's foster brother.
Zechariah stands up in a prominent place above the people, likely in the very courtyard of the temple Joash had repaired, and he publicly rebukes the king and the aristocracy. He says, "Why transgress ye the commandments of the Lord, that ye cannot prosper? Because ye have forsaken the Lord, he hath also forsaken you."
A direct, powerful warning.
And Joash's response, it is honestly one of the most shocking, stomach-turning acts of ingratitude and spiritual treachery in the entire biblical narrative. Joash, the king who was hidden from assassins in the temple, orders Zechariah to be stoned to death, right there, in the courtyard of the house of the Lord.
The psychological horror of that moment cannot be overstated. Stoning was a communal form of execution, typically reserved in the law of Moses for the most severe crimes, like blasphemy or treason. By ordering Zechariah stoned, Joash is legally framing the prophet of God as a traitor to the state.
He uses the apparatus of justice to commit murder. And the location, he murders his Savior's son in the exact physical space where he himself was saved. As the stones are hitting him, Zechariah's dying words are, "The Lord look upon it and require it," meaning, may God see this profound injustice and avenge my innocent blood.
That phrase, require it, is judicial language. He is appealing to the supreme judge of the universe to audit Joash's actions. And this specific martyrdom carries so much theological weight that centuries later, Jesus Christ himself references it.
Oh, the New Testament.
Yes. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is pronouncing devastating woes upon the corrupt, hypocritical religious leaders of his day. He condemns them for building tombs for the prophets while simultaneously plotting to kill him. Jesus says that upon them will come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar.
Abel was the first murder in the Hebrew Bible, recorded in Genesis. Zechariah, in the chronological ordering of the Hebrew canon, where Chronicles is the final book, is the last recorded murder. Jesus is saying, from A to Z, from the first to the last, you are guilty of silencing the truth with violence.
If we trace the causal links here, what we are witnessing in Joash is the complete, terrifying anatomy of sin. Apostasy is rarely a sudden switch. It is a slow fade.
It happens in stages.
It starts with partial obedience, tolerating the cultural compromise of the high places. That lack of internal fortitude leads to secular dependency and panic, stripping the temple to pay off Hazael. The trauma and shame of that capitulation leave him vulnerable to vanity and flattery, listening to the princes of Judah. And once the conscience is fully seared by compromise, it ends in violent, cold-blooded rebellion, using state power to murder the prophet of God.
Because he couldn't handle the mirror, Zechariah held up, so he shattered the mirror. But Zechariah's dying prayer, "The Lord required," does not echo into a void. The blood of the prophet cries out from the temple courtyard, and the harvest of Joash's sin is incredibly swift. Which brings us to section 5, the conspiracy and assassination.
The narrative convergence here is brilliant. We know from earlier that Hazael had accepted the bribe and turned away from Jerusalem. But Chronicles reveals that within a year of Zechariah's murder, in the spring of the following year, the Syrian army returns.
Wait, why would Hazael return if he already got paid?
Because that is the nature of appeasement. When you pay off a warlord, you don't buy peace, you just advertise that you have wealth and lack the spine to defend it. You fund your own future invasion.
That is a harsh reality.
But the second invasion is entirely different. Chronicles notes a crucial supernatural detail. The Syrian army that came to Jerusalem this time was actually quite small. They were vastly outnumbered by Judah's very great host. Yet this small Syrian raiding party absolutely decimates the massive Judean army.
A total reversal of military logic.
Precisely. They destroyed all the princes of the people, the exact same political elites who had flattered Joash into idolatry. They send the spoil back to Damascus, and they leave Joash severely wounded or diseased, suffering in his bed.
So the military defeat was not a matter of tactics, troop numbers, or siege engineering. It was a theological judgment. God actively removed his protective hedge and delivered a massive army into the hands of a small raiding party because Judah had forsaken the covenant.
God essentially stepped back.
And as Joash is lying there on his sickbed, severely wounded and humiliated, 2 Kings 12 verse 20 tells us the final dark chapter of his life. And his servants arose and made a conspiracy and slew Joash in the house of Millo, which goeth down to Silla.
His own trusted servants.
His own trusted servants, the people who guarded his bedchamber. And the text goes out of its way to name the assassins in verse 21. Josgar the son of Shemith and Jehozabad the son of Shomer. Why name the assassins? It feels like we're just reading a police blotter.
We have to look at the cross-reference in Chronicles again because it adds a detail about their parentage that carries immense poetic theological irony. The mothers of these two assassins were Shemith, an Ammonitess, and Shomer, a Moabitess.
The Ammonites and the Moabites. These are two neighboring nations with a deeply antagonistic history with Israel.
Yes. Tracing all the way back to the book of Genesis, the Moabites and Ammonites descended from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. According to the law of Moses in Deuteronomy, Ammonites and Moabites were traditionally excluded from the assembly of the Lord. They were foreign, out-of-covenant nations historically associated with leading Israel into horrific idolatry.
And somehow, women from these nations had become integrated into the royal court, likely as servants or wives of lower officials, and their sons became the king's real guards.
Because Joash had abandoned the covenant of Yahweh and embraced foreign syncretic worship, God sovereignly allowed the sons of foreign, out-of-covenant women to enact divine justice right inside the inner sanctum of the royal palace. Joash was killed by the very pagan influences he had culturally embraced.
He sowed compromise, and he literally reaped the harvest from within his own staff. And the geographical location of the assassination is loaded with irony, too. He is killed in the house of Millo. For the listener, the Millo wasn't just a house. Millo literally translates to the fill.
It was a fortress.
It was a massive, fortified earthwork rampart, a terraced defensive structure built on the steep eastern slopes of Jerusalem by King David and King Solomon to support the city and keep it safe from external threats. It was essentially the most secure bunker in the capital.
It is the ultimate irony of his life. He spent his reign terrified of external threats like Hazael, stripping the temple to buy security. Yet he is murdered in the very fortress designed to provide absolute physical security. It proves a profound spiritual principle.
Oops.
When God's protection is lifted due to rebellion, no physical wall, no fortress, no earthwork rampart, and no amount of tribute gold can keep you safe. The threat wasn't outside the walls anymore, the rot was inside the house.
And his death is followed by a final stinging mark of disgrace regarding his burial. 2 Kings 12 says he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. But again, Chronicles adds the painful caveat. He was buried in the city, but not in the tombs of the kings.
Even in death, the prophetic historian and the nation reject his legacy. He is deemed unworthy to rest alongside David, Solomon, or even his mentor, Jehoiada the priest, who was buried in the royal tombs. Joash leaves behind a kingdom fractured, traumatized, and materially depleted by his own failures. He is succeeded by his son, Amaziah.
So we have just walked through a massive amount of history. We've looked at the geopolitical tensions of a divided kingdom, the bureaucratic failures of the priesthood, the siege tactics of a Syrian warlord, the psychological vulnerability of a boy king, and a bloody conspiracy.
It is a lot to take in.
If we take a step back and move into section 6 of our deep dive, the synthesis, what are the profound, multi-dimensional lessons we can extract from this ancient text for our modern lives? How does this relate to us individually, culturally, and globally today?
To start, we have to recognize the unseen, behind-the-scenes spiritual battles that frame this entire narrative. This chapter isn't just about an ancient king making bad political choices or mismanaging construction funds. This is a multi-generational spiritual war for the seed of David.
Explain that for us.
If you trace the biblical narrative all the way back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:15, God promises that a seed of the woman will eventually crush the head of the serpent. That seed is the Messianic line, which narrows down to the tribe of Judah, and specifically to the family of King David.
Right, leading to Jesus.
Satan understands this. He attempted to wipe out that Messianic line completely through the murderous rampage of Queen Athaliah, but God intervened and preserved Joash.
So the enemy failed to destroy the seed through brute force. But the enemy is incredibly patient.
Exactly. When outright murder failed, the enemy shifted tactics. He decided that if he couldn't destroy the seed physically, he would destroy it through internal corruption. He waited decades, he let Joash do a lot of good, let him repair the temple, let him rule in peace, and simply waited for Jehoiada the priest to die. Then the enemy struck through the flattery of the princes, through fear of Hazael, and through the slow fade of syncretism.
And this historical reality is incredibly rich with typology and metaphor. Typology, for those unfamiliar, is how historical events in real persons in the Old Testament foreshadow greater spiritual truths and point toward the New Testament.
It's a beautiful way to read the text.
If we look at Joash, he is a type of the preserved seed. He points faintly to the coming Messiah. He is hidden away. His life is miraculously spared, and he rises to the throne to restore the temple. But because Joash ultimately fails, caves to fear, and falls into murderous sin, his life demonstrates the absolute necessity for the true eternal king. He shows us that a flawed human monarch can never permanently save the people. We need Jesus Christ, the king, who faces the ultimate external threat on the cross and never compromises.
And Jehoiada operates as a beautiful type of Christ as the high priest. He is a faithful guardian who protects the vulnerable king, orchestrates the overthrow of the usurper, restores true covenant worship, and acts as a mediator for the nation.
I also think the entire temple repair narrative is a profound allegory. Repairing the physical temple is such a potent metaphor for repairing the human heart, or even reforming a modern institution or church. The text focuses heavily on the breaches, the structural damages in the walls.
You can't ignore the cracks.
Right. If you want to restore a life, a family, or an institution, you cannot just paint over the cracks. You cannot just focus on the shiny aesthetic things, the silver bowls and trumpets. You have to address the foundational breaches honestly. You need the dual-control transparency of the king's scribe and the high priest. You need the quiet, faithful integrity of the workmen who handle the resources without needing an audit.
Conversely, the tribute paid to Hazael is a chilling metaphor for spiritual compromise. It perfectly represents a believer trying to negotiate with the enemy. Joash traded away his spiritual inheritance, the hallowed, dedicated things of his fathers, just to buy a fleeting sense of worldly security.
And it never works. The enemy always comes back. Hazael took the gold, left for a few months, and his army returned the very next spring to decimate Judah. You cannot appease darkness by handing over the treasures of the light. The darkness will just consume the treasure and then come for your life.
That is a truth that resonates globally today. Whether you are looking at international relations, corporate ethics, or personal morality, appeasement of evil only emboldens it.
So bringing this down to the individual listener right now, if you are navigating your own faith journey, managing your family, or trying to lead in your community, I think the most pressing psychological question this text asks you is this: who is your Jehoiada?
That is a big question.
We all need mentors. We all need guides, pastors, and parents who instruct us in what is right. But Joash's life is a blaring siren warning us about the extreme danger of living purely on borrowed faith. We cannot survive on the vicarious faith of the people around us.
It has to be your own.
When your Jehoiada is removed from the picture, whether through death, distance, a career change, or even disillusionment, what is left of your foundation? Joash teaches us the absolute necessity of behavioral and mind renewal. We must cultivate a deeply personal, internalized relationship with truth that holds firm even when the social scaffolding is stripped away and the cultural elites start flattering us to compromise.
It is a critical teaching moment for believers, and culturally it serves as a severe warning about institutional stagnation. We look at those priests who collected money for 23 years and did nothing, and we recognize the bureaucratic inertia that plagues so many modern institutions. It highlights the absolute necessity of practical accountability.
Accountability is key.
But ultimately, 2 Kings 12 is a sobering warning to the rebellious. The biblical law of sowing and reaping is immutable. As the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians 6:7, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Joash sowed betrayal when he murdered Zechariah, and he reaped assassination in his own bed by his own servants. He sowed compromise with the high places, and he reaped cultural destruction. It reminds us that a good start in life, a miraculous origin story, or even a season of immense religious zeal does not guarantee a faithful finish. The trajectory of our lives is determined by our persistent daily faithfulness to the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
A good start does not guarantee a faithful finish. What a heavy but incredibly necessary truth to internalize.
It really is.
To summarize this massive arc we've been exploring today, 2 Kings 12 takes us on an unparalleled journey. We start with the miraculous survival of a 7-year-old boy king hidden in the dark recesses of the temple. We watch him rise to the zenith of his reign, innovating financial systems and restoring the physical center of worship. And then we watch in horror as he descends into the tragic depths of paranoia, stripping that same temple bare to appease a warlord, murdering the son of his savior in the courtyard, and dying violently in his own secure fortress at the hands of his own staff. It is a masterpiece of historical narrative that lays the complexities of the human heart bare.
It truly covers the whole spectrum of human experience.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder long after you finish listening. We talked early on about how Joash did what was right, but he failed to remove the high places, those localized, unauthorized altars where the people compromised their worship.
The half measures.
He likely thought they were harmless, a minor cultural concession, too politically difficult to tear down. But those high places fostered the very environment of syncretism that ultimately devoured his kingdom and cost him his life.
They were the seeds of his destruction.
So think about the landscape of your own life. If an ancient king's catastrophic downfall began with the seemingly small, culturally acceptable compromises he refused to tear down, what harmless high places are you allowing to remain in your life right now? And what might they cost you in the end?
A powerful question to sit with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep seeking knowledge, keep questioning your assumptions, and always look beneath the surface. We'll see you next time.